Morning, YouTube. Planning on recording part 2 of the ABC special by Richard Adey titled Hot Mess.
Mother's Day, Julia Morrow with you for Sunday Extra. In just a moment, part 2 of Hot Mess, looking at why we've done so little about climate change with Richard Adey. In the first episode last Sunday, we heard about psychology, our biases and traits that aren't helpful when it comes to getting our heads around climate change, and even less helpful for deciding what to do about it. In today's second episode, how a small group of people were able to take advantage of this and delay real action.
November 1996. The English Patients in the cinema, the Spice Girls are on the radio, Bill Clinton's just been re-elected. And an Australian with close ties to both the mining industry and right-wing think tanks flies into Washington, D.C. His name is Ray Evans, and he's there for a meeting with an advocacy group, one opposed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the Global Climate Coalition.
The meeting was held at the headquarters of the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and they came up with a global strategy to defeat Kyoto, and it was agreed that Australia would be a key to that.
That meeting is still having consequences, almost a quarter of a century later. Hello, I'm Richard Adey. This is Hot Mess, the series that looks at why we've done so little about climate change. In the first episode, we heard about psychology. The short version is that we have biases and traits that have been part of why we've been so successful as a species, but they're not helpful when it comes to getting our heads around climate change, and they're even less helpful for deciding to do something about it. This time, how a small group of people were able to take advantage of this and delay any real action. I'm just going to walk you through something. To limit how much the planet warms up, so far it's about 1 degree, it's a little bit more in Australia, we have to put less carbon into the atmosphere, much less, and then we have to stop. That means not burning fossil fuels, oil, gas and coal. These are the energy sources that built the world economy and still mostly underpin it. They're a massively big deal, especially here. We get about 2/3 of our electricity from coal and around 9% from gas. And we sell this stuff overseas. Last year, we got $44 billion for metallurgical coal and $21 billion for thermal coal. Taken together, coal's our second biggest export. Gas is our fourth biggest. Last year, it made $51 billion. So there's a lot at stake, and it explains a bit too. I first heard about climate change in the late 80s, but the oil industry had known about it for quite a bit longer. Ian Dunlop used to work in coal, but he started his career in oil.
Climate change is one of the issues that was around in the early 60s and so on, not in the sense of being an emergency, but the fact that sooner or later this was going to become a problem for the fossil fuel industries, which would have to be addressed.
So hang on, you were saying that basically the fossil fuel industries were aware that a problem was coming and started to think about how to deal with it?
The science was around in those days that obviously increasing carbon emissions in the atmosphere was going to influence temperature and so on. It wasn't being looked at seriously in those days, one has to say. I mean, it was one of those, if you like, left-of-field issues that people were aware of.
By the late 70s, the industry's own research meant it had a lot more information.
So you had two responses. I think one, which was really saying, look, you know, we've essentially grown the world economy and created wealth since the Industrial Revolution, but particularly since World War II. The thought that that might in fact grind to a halt and we would have to fundamentally rethink the way the economy is run was anathema to a lot of people, particularly ones who've been in the industry, I guess, for a long time and had always really never experienced anything other than the fact that the oil industry would expand, that markets would expand and demand would keep increasing. On the other hand, there were groups of people who were very much technological, scientifically orientated, who accepted that this, in fact, was going to develop into a problem.
Guess which group won the argument? 3
we found a trail of documents that go back to 1977. Exxon knew carbon dioxide was increasing in the atmosphere, that combustion of fossil fuels was driving it, and that this posed a threat to Exxon.
This emerged in 2015. It lies at the heart of a series of lawsuits in the US, and Congress has been hearing all about it.
Dr. Hopper, your work with Exxon was focused on the carbon cycle and climate modeling. I have a slide up here. Are you familiar with this graph from 1982? Can you briefly explain what it shows?
Sure. What it shows is a projection into the future of carbon dioxide levels and climate change associated with those carbon dioxide levels. And it's a very accurate representation of what today's climate change actually is.
So the oil industry really knew by the late 70s and sort of knew in the 60s. And because of this man, we know that the coal industry knew in the 60s too.
Okay, so testing 1, 2, 3. I'm telling you about the weather that happened in Tennessee. We got a ton of rain in the month of February.
You sound great.
Okay.
This is Chris Cherry. He's a civil engineer at the University of Tennessee. And last August, he got an email from a colleague.
And she mentioned that she was clearing out a stockpile of old literature and books and other things that had been building up. And anybody who wanted them could pick them up that day, or they were going to recycling after that. So I was walking by on my way out of work, and I happened across this Mining Congress Journal. Picked it up mostly out of intrigue and interest because my in-laws, my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, both were in the mining industry in the 70s and 80s and until now, really.
So he's flipping through it, really looking for a picture of the mine they used to work at.
As I flipped across, I found this article called Air Pollution and the Coal Industry.
Most of it's about acid rain, sulfur dioxide, but there's something else.
The author goes on to describe in very concise and clear detail what we know today as the effects of climate change from CO2 emissions. It talks about the CO2 envelope reduces radiation and the temperatures of the Earth's atmosphere will increase. And because of that, vast changes in the Earth's climate will result.
There's detail. It mentions flooding in cities like New York and London. And there's a follow-up piece.
It goes on to discuss the emerging challenges with air pollution and with environmental impacts from coal. The last section is the situation is urgent, and it talks about how we need to clean up our air. We've gone beyond the days of nuisance. We need to identify how the coal industry is contributing to air and kind of get ahead of the regulations and try to understand that.
So what did you think?
My department head was walking by, and he's an environmental engineer. And I nudged him. I said, look at this. Is this amazing? Is this unusual? Or what is the importance of this? And to him, it seemed like a very early understanding. So I came home, I showed it to my wife and my kids, and it really struck me at that moment that 50 years ago, the coal industry was understanding pretty clearly what they were contributing to. And I looked around the table at the dinner table with my kids, thinking that they were going to live a life under the assault of climate change, and they're going to be impacted by some short-sighted coal executives who decided to ignore this call for action and this understanding and focus on short-term profit or whatever it may be.
So the coal industry knew it was making the planet warmer in 1966, but the rest of us only find out about this at the end of last year, because of chance. This is Hot Mess, the series that looks at why we've done so little about climate change, on RN or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Richard Adey. So we know that the oil and gas industries knew what was happening with the climate, and we know that they did nothing about it, except to deny that it was going on. In June of 1988, just as I was finishing my journalism course, NASA scientist James Hansen told Congress that climate change was real. The fossil fuel industry did not muck about.
One of the very first campaigns, fossil fuel funded campaign, certainly to attack the science of climate change, was kicked off 19 1990 by a guy called Fred Palmer, who was a lobbyist for the Western Fuels Association in the United States.
That's Graham Redfern. He's an environment reporter for The Guardian.
He started a campaign there that was really there to undermine the science, to cast doubt on the science. Now, why around then? I've spoken to Fred Palmer, and he says, well, that year, 1988, was the year that James Hansen, the NASA scientist, told Congress that human-caused climate change was now noticeable, it was now observed, we could see it, and it was now happening. It was also the same time that the UN formed its Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Fred Palmer has told me that really then he saw the writing on the wall and decided that they had to engage.
By 1990, governments, including ours, were starting to take climate change seriously.
Ladies and gentlemen, in my environment statement last year, I made a commitment that Australia would play its part in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, both domestically and internationally.
Bob Hawke had an emissions target that he took to Parliament. It was never successfully voted on, but that tagged emissions cuts up to 2005. And there was a feeling 25, 30 years ago in Australia that everyone was on the same page. It was just now a matter of how were we going to achieve this.
Those emissions cuts, the ones that never happened, were for 20%. But even as Hawke was speaking, you just heard him in May of 1991, the Business Council and resources sector were pushing back against targets.
By the middle of the 90s, in Australia certainly, lobbyists for some of the big end of town had really managed to convince government on both sides that you couldn't save the environment and save the economy at the same time. You know, you had to make a choice, and that was pretty much set by, I would say, the mid-90s.
The arguments up to this point in Australia are economic. They're about costs and benefits. They're not about the science. That's about to change. At the end of 1996, Ray Evans travels to America. He works for the Western Mining Corporation and is one of the founders of the H.R. Nichols Society. He's anti-union, anti-regulation, and anti-climate change. Elaine McEwen's a PhD student at the University of Technology in Sydney. Her research tracks how climate science was made deeply controversial.
In November 1996, Ray Evans attended a landmark meeting with senior members of the Global Climate Coalition in the United States, and the meeting was held at the headquarters of the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. And the Competitive Enterprise Institute had been one of the very early think tanks to take up the cause of attacking the scientific consensus and trying to defeat any attempts by the U.S. to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. So there were three goals that were set at this meeting. And the first one was to develop a global strategy to derail the Kyoto Treaty. Secondly, it was also agreed that Australia would be a key player in the global strategy. And thirdly, they wanted to hold a series of conferences, both in the United States and in Australia, in the lead up to the Kyoto Climate Change Conference in December 1997.
They succeed at all three.
As would be expected, the agreement is essentially a political compromise. Overall, the developed countries of the world have agreed to reduce their 1990 level emissions by 5.2% through to 2012. But in line with Australia's request, different countries have separate targets. Japan, the United States and the European Union have reduction targets of 6 to 8%, whereas Australia is one of the few countries allowed to actually increase emissions by 8%. Australia's task is made all the more easier by a special clause introduced solely for Australia's benefit. It increases the emissions for the 1990 base year by including land clearing, that is, getting rid of vegetation which soaks up carbon dioxide emissions. Australia can therefore use a reduction in the rate of land clearing to contribute towards greenhouse gas emission cuts.
So Australia gets a special deal, and the Americans get one they will never ratify. That's not enough for the Global Climate Coalition.
So after the Kyoto Protocol was signed in December 1997, the Global Climate Coalition decided to kick things up a notch. What they did was they coordinated the Global Climate Science Communication Action Plan. Once I saw this, I could see all of the strategies and the tactics used in the US and then later imported and adopted by the IPA. As far as the strategy is concerned, it had two main goals. And one was, and I'm quoting, inform the public that science does not support the Kyoto Protocol, end of quote. And secondly, quote, provide a climate for the right policy decisions to be made. And needless to say, that is basically no action at all.
So that's the strategy, Elaine. What about the tactics?
Front and center, we have what they call the National Media Relations Program, and that was to arrange high-level public relations council, recruit contrarian scientists who were prepared to dispute the scientific consensus in media interviews, op-eds, letters to the editor, that sort of thing, give them media training, public relations training, and then promote them as experts in the field of climate science. To the average person reading the opinions of these people who happen to be scientists, the news media, for all the world, they thought that basically the science was still very much up in the air. They created the impression that there was no consensus and that the science didn't support action on climate change. And then finally, they wanted grassroots support groups to further appeal to the public. These are all things that were taken on by the IPA. Even the key performance indicators, they did opinion surveys to gauge the shift in public opinion. They tracked the percentage of media articles that challenged the scientific consensus, the number of radio talk show appearances that were made by the contrarian scientists, and above all, the total audience that had been exposed to all of this media coverage.
So that meeting in Washington is really important for the Australian interests opposed to cutting emissions. It gives them contacts and know-how and an instruction manual.
I've described climate science denial as sort of like an industry. And there are cogs in the industry, and these think tanks are a really important one. So what they do is they will produce policy papers, they will speak freely in the media, they will go on speaking tours, they will write books. In fact, there was a study a few years ago into all of the books that had been written that cast doubt on the science of climate change and that it was human caused. And almost every single one of the books that had been written since the early 90s was produced by somebody in one of these think tanks. They help to sort of set the public discourse in train. They're able to sort of propagandize the issue and polarize it.
In March of 2000, Ray Evans co-founds the Lavoisier Group, specifically to challenge climate science. And it wasn't alone.
So you had Lavoisier, you had then the emergence of industry groups like the Australian Industry Greenhouse Network, the Minerals Council, the Business Council itself. All of these groups were strongly climate denialists. They have been, in my view, some of the greatest impediments to serious climate change policy being developed in this country. And frankly, that continues to this day. There is still a very strong senior group of people who actually will never believe that climate change is real. Apart from groups I've mentioned, you've then got groups who are not directly in the fossil fuel world, like the Institute of Public Affairs, which has become a very strong voice for climate denialism.
The Institute of Public Affairs is headed by John Roscombe.
The approach has been described as sceptical, which I would accept. The argument that humans may have some impact on the environment and on the climate, I think, is broadly accepted. The question is, how much impact is there? That's still uncertain. The question is, what is the science around climate change and atmospheric change? That's still uncertain. And then leaving aside those uncertainties, even if they became certain, there's the question of what do we do about it? And my argument is that in a democracy, it's not scientists who decide what should be the public policy answers. It should be the politicians elected by the people. So you've got a question of A, what is happening? And B, what should we do about it?
Actually, for years, the IPA did not give the impression it was accepting the argument that humans were having an impact on the climate.
The IPA would have published its very first piece of research and analysis on what was then called global warming in the late 1990s. And from that, as it became a public policy issue related to energy policy, economics, and then politics, the IPA really started heavily involving itself in the debate, probably in 2005 to 2010.
I would pinpoint the year 2005, and that's mainly because of changes that happened at the Institute of Public Affairs that year. John Ruskin had been appointed as executive director, and 2005 was actually the year that the Kyoto Protocol went into force. And I think that is when the fossil fuel lobby decided that we needed to kick things up a notch. And so the IPA launched a media campaign in order to discredit the scientific consensus on climate change and mainstream science more generally, and oppose Australia introducing legislation to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
Elaine McEwen says John Ruskin grasped the importance of using the media.
He made making inroads into the Fairfax press a priority. And from that year, 2005, you can see the numbers climbing year by year, 150%, 200%, until we get up to the year 2009, when we had our first parliamentary debates about introducing an ETS in Australia. And that was definitely the bumper year, because that was the year that the IPA's associate Ian Plimer published his book. Actually, the IPA launched his book, and it turned the whole public conversation around in the lead up to the parliamentary debates about introducing an ETS.
It's a book for the public who have felt quite disenfranchised and quite helpless that they have scientists talking down to them, and they know there's a smell. They can't quite work out where the smell's from, but they know there's a smell. And this book is to give the public some information such that they can say, I think we're being led astray.
The issue of debating the public space, I think, is a really important question about democracy and politics. From my perspective, basically since Kevin Rudd talked about climate change being Australia's greatest modern challenge, the key public institutions of Australia haven't welcomed a debate. The media hasn't. I don't think the universities have. Certainly views of climate change are now embedded in the school curriculum. We now have a judicial system that is embracing aspects of climate change litigation. So one of the things that the IPA has done over its 75-year history is simply demonstrate the facts, distribute the facts, mount the arguments, and debate the science. The position of the IPA has been greatly assisted, if I can say, by the attitude of some public institutions that haven't welcomed a debate.
The IPA has tied this to another issue that it campaigns on, freedom of speech. And it's had real success, especially over the last decade.
The rise of digital technology, the rise of social media has allowed us to disseminate our research and communicate ideas in a way that even 10 years ago would not have been feasible to us. The idea that the mainstream media and institutional media are now the gatekeepers to ideas is gradually being eroded. And one of the things that has certainly, from my perspective, been really encouraging is the democratisation of the discussion of climate change. And I think one of the things that frustrates the universities and the institutions is that people can have an opinion, people can look at the research themselves, whether they are a professor of physics or whether they're a farmer on their tractor or whether they're a mum or a dad. They can look at the data, they can read the articles, they can engage in debate. Now, a lot of people are very uncomfortable with what I call the mass democratisation of public policy, but I think this is a very live thing that certainly the IPA has sought to take advantage of.
A key argument the IPA makes, and you hear this a lot, is that Australia's carbon emissions are only a small part of the global total compared to China, the US and India.
it's never been answered exactly what will Australia do that will make any difference. And the argument is, well, Australia has to lead by moral force, it has to lead by example. There's actually no case of that ever working in Australia's context. So you've got all of these things happening.
We have a huge amount to lose. We're probably, perhaps the Netherlands would argue with this, but of all the wealthy countries, we have what would seem to be the most on the line, and surely with the most on the line, we could argue with the bigger emitters more persuasively if we're prepared to do more ourselves.
Well, again, I'd argue there's no evidence for that.
All right.
I'm sorry you're frustrated.
No.
But again,
what I feel is that it doesn't matter what I say on this, to be honest.
No, look, but I think it does. But the argument that Australia
in World War I, Australia, tiny country, really barely more than a dominion, happily went and took on a vast task. We did. With other small organisations as well. We've just had been part of an empire, but we didn't go, we're too little to do anything. We just signed up and went for it.
I think you could argue that 60,000 dead from the First World War had a huge impact on the course of the First World War. I'm not sure what anything Australia does will impact China, India, or the United States.
The IPA has been very successful in making its arguments.
Even the swamp wallaby vomits listening to that prick.
Money.
John Ruskin gained charitable status for the IPA as an Australian research institute and also a deductible gift recipient. And so its donors could write off their donations as tax deductions. And that was important because it's quite costly to run a sustained media campaign in order to defeat or avoid legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
So, John, who funds the IPA?
Our 6,000 members.
But there's some big donors from... what I'm getting to, John, as I'm sure you're aware, is that there is a suspicion that there will be companies or individuals with a vested interest in the continued extraction and use of fossil fuels.
Oh, Richard, I think universities have a vested interest in their climate change research. I think renewable energy companies have a vested interest in their position. I'm sceptical about this vested interest argument.
Well, we know from disclosures to the New South Wales Supreme Court that Gina Reinhardt's company, Hancock Prospecting, donated $4.5 million over 2 years to the IPA in 2016 and 2017.
And your point is?
My point is that Gina Reinhardt has a vested interest in the continued extraction and sale of coal.
Look, that's for others to argue. And Gina Reinhardt is a wonderful honorary life member of the Institute of Public Affairs. But again, when we're talking about vested interest, is that any different from the university that is talking about positions on climate change to continue its funding?
Overall, how effective has the IPA been at slowing action on climate? Graham Redfern from The Guardian.
There's lots of ways we could measure that, right? We could look at opinion polls. And even though we've seen a very recent spike in Australia around concern for climate change and environmental action, mostly driven by the bushfire crisis that we've just been through, there's actually not been a great deal of movement amongst members of the public that accept that climate change is happening and is human caused. That's the important sort of rider there. We're still sort of at around 60-65% of the population, depending on which opinion poll you look at, that accept that climate change is caused mostly by humans. That's despite 25-30 years of science, more actually, showing that that's essentially indisputable. So that's one way of measuring their effectiveness. The other is in the policy platforms of successive governments. Australia is still saddled with a target on climate change that its own climate change authority said was inadequate.
This is Hot Mess on RN or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Richard Adey. Although social media is now hugely important for think tanks and others who want to delay action on climate change, getting into the mainstream media still really matters. Paul Barry from Media Watch.
I think the media's played an enormous part. I think if the media had been behind the science,
and had believed it, then Australia would have done far more. I'm talking of both sides of politics. I think they'd have taken it far more seriously. And I think the key to that is that the public would have been much more receptive to it. What the media has done is to introduce doubt, to suggest that it's all a conspiracy, or to suggest that it's not as serious, or that man's involved, or there's nothing we can do about it. Any number of reasons for not doing anything. And I think that means that politicians can get away with not doing anything because the public doesn't demand it.
And it's pretty clear which part of the media has been the most important here.
The media group that has really held up action on climate change and done its absolute utmost to stop action happening or to have the public believe in it is News Corp. It's not the whole of News Corp. News.com.au is actually rather different, but it's the columnists in the tabloid newspapers, the very loud, very highly paid, very big columnists in the tabloids, the same people who appear on Sky News, and then it's also the Australian newspaper. The tabloids themselves in their news have played it fairly straight, but it's the columnists who are relentless in their urging that climate change is ridiculous or over-exaggerated or everyone's getting it wrong or whatever their arguments are. But basically, we don't need to do anything about it.
Now, look, I didn't want to talk about global warming again. But, sweet heaven, that's all I'm hearing at the moment. Global warming, global warming, global warming.
The key people are Andrew Bolt, Chris Kenny, Piers Ackerman, to a lesser degree probably, some people in the Australian as well, the sort of lesser columnists there, then Terry McCrann in the Herald Sun. There's a bunch of them. They all really speak with the same voice. They don't share exactly the same position, but you won't, to my knowledge, find anyone in those News Corp columnists who says, hey, this is a really serious thing and we really need to do something about it, and for God's sake, let's stop pretending that it's not.
Andrew Bolt's position is that he accepts that the planet's warming, but not as much as scientists have predicted, that it won't be catastrophic, and that attempts to do something about it are both hugely expensive and close to useless.
I think there's a strong ideological argument. They just believe it, these people. But I think also it is commercially very good for these papers and for that channel. Climate denialism or climate skepticism drives subscriptions to the Australian. It drives subscriptions to Sky. You look at anything remotely like a pro-climate change article in the Australian, the comments underneath it will be absolutely vituperative. They will be so angry that that has appeared in their newspaper. So there's a big audience out there who love them saying this stuff.
You're listening to Australia's #1 broadcaster, Alan Jones.
The percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 0.04%. It's equivalent to saying there's a granule of sugar on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The bridge is dirty. We must clean it. Get that granule of sugar off.
So 2GB is conservative talkback radio station in Sydney. It also goes out in Brisbane on 4BC. It's most of the same people, and it's networked around the country. Some of their programs on Jones and Hadley. Hadley not so much, but Jones believes climate change is a hoax. And Chris Smith, who's another one of those on 2GB, also. I mean, he's not quite as rapid as Jones, but he also believes it's overblown, it's ridiculous, it's not worth talking about. So 2GB has the same sort of audience as the Australian, old, white, conservative, and they lap it up. And so they, again, are giving them what they want. But they're also creating that audience, and they're creating that belief and reinforcing that belief.
Paul Barry is concerned that in making climate change into something that's contested and controversial, News Corp and 2GB have done something bigger.
I think all this media coverage makes people unsure about science. I think it's the whole business of devaluing science and devaluing what scientists say and saying it's all a matter of opinion. That is, in a way, the most damaging thing, because it takes away your ability to know what's right and what's not right. And I think that's, in a way, ultimately more serious than the climate change stuff.
I was there for 5 years. I was commercial finance manager. I supported a number of different business units through my 5 years at News Corp.
This is Emily Townsend. She left News Corp in January after writing an all-staff email to the company's chairman, Michael Miller, about the coverage of climate change. Remember, this is what was going on at the time.
The
full extent of the damage is yet to be confirmed, but initial reports suggest dozens of homes have been destroyed, and that prompted panic as unsuspecting residents rushed to put fire plans into action. It comes as my partner's farm had actually been affected by the fires. He almost lost it. Then, you know, you go to work and you read a lot of the fires are being caused by arson, or arson is a factor, or, you know, promoting this agenda that that's what we should be focusing on, not climate change. And when it's actually, you know, so close to home, and when you're walking outside in your city and you can hardly breathe and you can't even see the CBD through all the smoke, that's really personal to me. And when I was reading the stuff that he was writing, you know, I had a conversation with one of my colleagues at News the day before the email, and I was like, you know, we're working for climate criminals here. I can't do this.
She's already resigned at this point, but that evening she decides she's going to write to Michael Miller and copy in everyone at News.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for your email regarding fundraising and other support initiatives in relation to the devastating fires. Unfortunately, however, this does not offset the impact News Corp reporting has had over the last few weeks. I have been severely impacted by the coverage of News Corp publications in relation to the fires, in particular the miscommunication campaign that has tried to divert attention away from the real issue, which is climate change, to rather focus on arson, including misrepresenting facts. I find it unconscionable.
And then you sent it.
It took me 10 minutes just to press the button. It took me the whole morning to type that email into my inbox. Sending that email, you know, the aftermath was really quite quiet. It was just very quiet, really.
All you could hear was your heart beating.
Yes.
I'm sure.
Basically, yeah.
So how long before it stopped being quiet?
So, finance team, it's not like there was, you know, screams and anything like that. I asked my colleagues, did you get my email? And they said yes. And then I started getting a lot of pings, you know, on Hangouts from people around the business saying, that was really brave, well done. Some people told me there were cheers in the newsrooms, which was really amazing to hear. I started getting a lot of emails, you know, with people saying similar comments that they actually also feel the same way. Then my phone rang. It was somebody talking very fast and asking me lots of questions, and I sort of answered them, but, you know, it was a very difficult time. I was very, you know, it's just all those emotions going through your body, doing something so a bit extreme. I wasn't really thinking straight, and then I finished answering all these questions. He told me he was from the SMH and it was going to be, you know...
So he hadn't told you that first?
I think he probably did, you know, but I just didn't really hear it. He said something like, I got your email, and I just assumed, oh, you must be someone internally, and maybe you're a reporter from within News Corp.
So it must have leaked?
Yeah, I think it leaked within minutes.
News put out a statement. News Corp stands by its coverage of the bushfires. We respect Ms Townsend's right to hold her views, but we do not agree with them. Our coverage has recognised that Australia is having a serious conversation about climate change and how to respond to it. However, it has also reflected there are a variety of views and opinions about the current fire crisis. The world started hearing about climate change, global warming, 30 years ago. The fossil fuel industries had already known for decades. And when the rest of us started worrying about it, they and others who opposed taxes and regulation started funding campaigns to discredit the science. Think tanks were the key, especially in Australia the IPA, and they were helped by the media, which until relatively recently was happy to frame the science as genuinely contested. Parts of News Corp still does. It's lost us 3 decades of action, but this couldn't have been achieved without the politicians. Next time on Hot Mess, how fossil fuels and politics come together in a country with a lot of fossil fuels.
It's been the poster child for the failure of the entire political system.
The gas industry's played an enormous part in delaying action on climate change for 2 reasons. One, it's framed itself as a transition fuel, and that's simply not true. And the second thing is it's embedding itself in the energy system for the long term.
I think the BCA has played a pretty damaging role as well. It's backflipped so many times now on climate policy, it could probably qualify for the Olympics.
That's simply not true. What we have done every step along this journey is be at the table to get change, to be at the table to get something working. But it's got to work.
I think the politics are incredibly fragile and shallow, and it's, I think, the greatest example of Canberra and Parliament failing the Australian people.
Hot Mess is produced by Belinda Summer. Thanks to Sabrina Lipovich for archive and Sophie Townsend for help with the script. Our sound engineer is Russell Stapleton. I'm Richard Adey.
And that was Hot Mess with Richard Adey. Julian Morrow with you on Sunday Extra.
Probably the only thing I can fault him with there is that it's not 30 years that we've been aware that burning fossil fuels adds to the carbon dioxide in the sky, and adding carbon dioxide in the sky increases the amount of heat that is retained within the atmosphere rather than re-radiating into space on the night side of the planet, and that is warming the atmosphere as a whole. We've known that since the 1880s, not the 1980s, since the 1880s. 1850s was when they first realised that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas. The experiment to prove that you can pretty much do yourself. Get some glass jars, coffee containers that have an airtight seal. Fill one of them with air, run the motor of your car and collect some exhaust gas in another one. The exhaust gas is largely carbon dioxide. There's other things in there, but largely carbon dioxide. Or you can get machines for making sparkling waters and drinks which use carbon dioxide cartridges, little cylinders of carbon dioxide. So you can get pure carbon dioxide commercially in the supermarket. You can also get nitrous oxide cartridges for similar machines for whipping cream, for God's sake. It's a high-tech decadence, isn't it? Anyway, that means that you can get air, you can get carbon dioxide, you can get nitrous oxide in your glass containers, accurately measure the temperature of the gases in the containers. Treat yourself. Go to a shop that sells digital infrared laser thermometers. With all the gases in their glass jars, in the shade, measure their temperatures, take them out in the sun, measure their temperatures every minute. And then, when they stop increasing in temperature, take them back inside and see how long it takes them to cool back down. And what you will no doubt discover is that the carbon dioxide heats up the fastest, it heats up the mostest, and it stays hot the longest. And since the 1850s, we've known that. In 1912, in Popular Mechanics magazine, published in the excited status of Norte Americano, there was an article saying that if we continued to burn coal, we would increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the sky and we would raise the temperature of the world. We've known this for 100 bloody years. So that's one point that I'd have to fault Richard Adey on. It's not 30 years. He's known for 30 years. This is a thing that people often seem to do. They project when they first learnt things to when everybody else in the world must have come into the understanding at the same moment. He learnt about it 30 years ago, therefore the world has known about it for 30 years. That's why when Alan Jones says, oh, it's a grain of sugar on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, it's 0.4%. 400, it's actually 415 parts per million at the moment. It was 330 in 1961 when I was born. It was about 275 in 1760, whatever it was, when Watson what invented his bloody steam engine, Robert Watson. Since then, we've taken the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere past the limits that it's ever moved beyond for millions of years, 4 million years at the moment. But the normal range is 180 to 280 parts. We'd already moved it from about 275 merrily on up to, I think it was 300 parts per million in 1900, maybe 310 or something like that. I know it was 330 in 1961. So all of the petrol and the coal and the oil and the gas that was burned in World War I and World War II, that only, together with the post-World War II industrial boom and everybody got a television and all that only brought it up from 300 to 330. We're sitting now on 415. And there are people who've spent their entire working lives manipulating and machinating and Machiavelliizing to try and stop the hoi polloi, the vast mass of humanity, from realizing what's going on, because these individuals perceive that it is a good thing to keep the people too stupid to think about it, keep them too stupefied, make them worry about which horse is going to come last racing in circles to go nowhere next week at Flemington or wherever the races are being held, Randwick. Get them all deeply interested in which feet brawl team is going to win next weekend. Motivate children and teenagers to go and break their bloody knees sideways while worrying about the score in the volleyball so that they'll limp for the rest of their bloody lives. Need a total knee replacement at 45 or something. Anything to stop the bloody people from thinking about anything that matters. Like, maybe it's time to stop shitting in the sky before the planet decides to wipe out humanity because, you know, our filthy nest fouling habits are threatening life on Earth. We have become an existential threat in the reactions of the rest of the biosphere. That's why the bat eater's lament virus has popped out of the remnants of the forest that we've been encroaching on from all sides. It's not anything new. It's we've known it was going to come ever since they started commercial passenger airline flight between continents. Deforestation and resource depletion, erosion, salination, desertification, devastation, overfishing, overharvesting. It's all part of broadacre harvest everythingism. The belief that the entire environment exists for no other purpose than to serve some humans' greedy fucking daydreams. I mean, you saw what happened. The bloody swamp wallaby vomited when it was listening to that twerp from the IPA, the Institute for Public Affairs, being paid by the mining company among the 6,000 donors to keep people who call themselves conservative, but they don't want to conserve any fucking thing at all except their own rich bank balances, their own flow of income. They are quite prepared for their grandchildren to have to work 3 casual jobs totaling 60 hours a week at minimum wages just to pay the rent in order that the multinationals can remain profitable so that the superannuation company can collect the dividends from the shares. that the grey nomads have invested in. They don't have a problem with that. They don't have a problem with the fact that, 30, 40 years ago, if a hailstorm yielded golf ball sized hailstones, that was national news. Golly, golly, gosh. Oh, look at this. Some cars got dented. Oh, that one had a broken windscreen. Now, it's not unusual for hailstones to be the size of bloody oranges and apples. Maybe 5 years ago, out around Narromine, they had a hailstone that killed sheep and kangaroos and horses died in a hailstorm from the impact of bloody great big lumps of ice the size of oranges coming down out of the sky. That's happened because we have warmed the atmosphere and pumped more energy into the system. It's like putting an epileptic in the cockpit of a jumbo jet with no autopilot, and it's push, pull, stepped and trod on every fucking control in the inside the cockpit. That's what humanity has done to the heat engine of the water cycle. The only way to really get your head around it is to think about the entire solar system as an intergenerational starship moving away from the Big Bang, orbiting the center of the Milky Way galaxy and all that. But planet Earth is sort of the living quarters. And this intergenerational starship is set up so that the organisms that live on planet Earth cooperate in such a way as to maintain optimal conditions for life to exist, to be most prolific. And anything that disturbs the temperature, the humidity, the pressure, the distribution of the heat and the water in the atmosphere, anything that disturbs that, the superorganism, the Gaia hypothesis, so to speak, works to get rid of that problem. Well, humanity has become that problem. You might as well say that a bunch of the crew living on the living quarters of spaceship solar system, they went insane, you see, and they decided what they wanted to do was chop down the air recyclers. That's the trees. They wanted to chop down the air recyclers because they were into broadacre agriculture. So they had to chop down the trees to make their fields. And then they figured out that if you dig down into the water recycling system and the sewage into food recycling system, you dig down into the ground, you can get stuff out of there that if you melt that in the heat over the burning air recyclers, you can make shiny metals and you can sell it to each other and you can call yourselves rich. And the fact that you're destroying the food, water and air recycling mechanisms in order to make your fucking trinkets and call yourself rich, that's not a problem. According to the people who are engaged in this grand enterprise, the entrepreneurs, the economists, from nomos, the Greek meaning to know. They know fucking everything. Trouble is, when they were in high school, they did not pay attention in biology in the first 4 years of high school. And as soon as they could get out of the science classes, they went and studied some other bloody thing. Commerce, economics, English, drama. Then they went to university and they studied economics and finance and business administration and political science. And they get further and further and further into dwelling in the mysteries and the marvels of the human-built environment, where everything they look up at and see is bigger than them and people made it. And they come to think of the environment as just this farm and a mine and a rubbish dump. Oh, yeah, there's a bloody ocean full of fish that you can catch all the fish in the ocean and dump all your pollution into the river that feeds into the ocean. That's their stumbling of the biosphere. And this piddling little minority of arseholes who wanted to continue digging fossil carbon out of the ground and getting paid for selling it to somebody who was going to burn it and stick it in the sky, they decided 30, 40 years ago, they were talking in the 1960s for those coal miners, 50 years ago, they decided that this is going to be a problem for us commercially if anybody lets the scientists talk to the population at large. They're going to stop buying this poisonous shit that we want to sell them. That is the global warming conspiracy. And on that point, it was called global warming right up until people decided for a while to be worried about nuclear winter effect and an imminent instant ice age. And the forces of confusion latched onto that. And somehow in the argument, global warming, instead of being what the denialists spoke about, because they said, oh, well, the climate's always changing, whereas the scientists talked about the problem is greenhouse effect, anthropogenic global warming caused by greenhouse effect because we keep burning carbon and sticking it in the sky. Global warming was the science community's method of describing it. Climate change was the denialist way of saying, yeah, but you know, you're talking about the climate's going to change in the future because of global warming, but the climate's always changing. And, you know, we had a big heat wave last year, so therefore it's going to be a big snowy winter this year. And there are people in the Murdoch press and Fox News and Sky News who have been apparently pumping that idea. I've had commenters come up at me in the thread saying, oh, you're going to have the coldest winter you've ever had. You've got to go and buy coal because, you know, you won't be warm enough just burning firewood. And it's all bullshit. They keep expecting that because we've just broken a high temperature, now we're going to break a low temperature because it always evens out, because it moves in cycles, because that is their theology. It's been fed to them by pricks like Andrew Bolt and Alan Jones. And Alan Jones and Alex Jones strike me as birds of a feather who flock together. Fantasists, people who have no moral problem with telling lies for a living because it butters their bread. Yeah. And here's another really big factor, particularly in the manipulation of US public opinion. Once upon a time, if you published a newspaper or broadcast a radio or a television program which was news, and if it crossed state borders in the US, there was a federal congressional requirement that all news and editorial material had to be true and provable according to the best known science at the time. It was literally a federal crime to tell lies in the news and the editorials. And then a fella called Rupert Murdoch happened, who apparently his father didn't pay enough attention to him, and therefore he's grown up with a chip on both shoulders, where on the one hand he's got a hole in his self-esteem, and on the other hand he tries to fill it by doing things that make him feel he's bigger and better and more powerful and richer than his father. Bigger success, you see. Okay, well, he found that he couldn't make any more money in Australia because the laws prevented any one person from owning too much of the news or the radio or the TV. So he went to England and he had a go at making a heap of money in England, and they have laws over there too, and it didn't work out for him, and a couple of his associates weren't real bright. So then he thought about it, and he applied for American citizenship, which meant that he had to renounce his Australian citizenship. And we pretty much said, well, okay, you don't want to be an Australian, fuck off, you know. So he self-exiled to the excited status. And that was back in the 80s, early 80s. And when he got to the excited status, and I will wager before then, because he'd already bought up as much American media as he was permitted by American law to buy. So he was able to lobby because he owned a chunk of TV stations or newspapers or whatever it was that he was into at the time. And he lobbied Reagan's administration to repeal this congressional requirement to tell the truth, because that would be an unconstitutional constriction on an American citizen's constitutional freedom of speech. Under the First Amendment, the Free Speech Amendment, he got them to repeal the requirement to tell the truth in the news, because Fox Entertainment is entertainment. They brand it as news, but they produce it as entertainment. They don't do journalism. They do sensationalist muckraking and gaslighting. They'll say anything if they think it will be exciting to the viewers, because exciting the viewers causes them to stick harder and watch for longer, and that means that you can sell more ads and you can charge more money for the ads. And I don't know whether Murdoch intended to destroy the collective powers of reason of the American population, but it's what he's done. And they've voted for a buffoon who's apparently, according to Thunderfoot on his Voice of Thunder channel, and he's a PhD in nuclear physics, so he's pretty good with his computer and finding data and manipulating it, putting it into a graphic form so that you can understand what's going on. I'm not endorsing any of his YouTube dramatic flame war activity that he's had with various feminists and creationists, but his updates on this coronavirus are pretty good. And he reckons that until Trumpy decided that he was going to cancel the lockdown and the social distancing because it's all too inconvenient for the economy, until then, America was kind of tracking towards 110,000 dead by the 4th of July, Independence Day. But yeah, 40 states, or maybe it was 48 states, they've decided that they're going to reopen despite the fact that their daily case count of corona is increasing. So Thunderfoot reckons that means they're now on track for 1 million dead by the 4th of July. And if at that point they wake up to himself and tell Trumpy to pull his bloody head in, then they may hold it down to 1.5 million dead. But if they go balls out and say, well, that's it, we've spent a couple of months being locked up and we're just going to put up with the virus, let it run wild, because at the moment only 1% of their population has been infected. There's a lot of them to go and get infected, and the wild kill rate for confirmed cases is still about 7.5%. And even if you're really generous and say, well, only half the people who get the virus get it enough to become a confirmed case, so therefore it's only a 3.25% kill rate. Yeah, you're still looking at 1 or 2 million, maybe 1 to 3 million Americans turning their toes up by Christmas, November. And they voted for that because they thought that science and knowing things didn't matter, because their opinion was as good as anybody else's opinion, because it was profitable for somebody else to think that and to have them think that and to train them to think that. And people wonder why all the animals in the biosphere are sitting up and clapping the Chinese horseshoe bat. And it's pangolin mutated virus. Because between the two of them, the bats and their runaway virus, they've been responsible for the biggest reduction in human greenhouse gas emissions since before Russia collapsed. I don't think there's ever been a sudden cessation of, well, airline travel. A lot less passenger ships. If in doubt, do something simple. Yeah, we've pushed it to the point where the rest of the biosphere has decided to cull our numbers. And by a remarkable coincidence, instead of just blazing through the human population and killing everybody, it's us old farts who've been voting to go ahead with global warming and deforestation and species extinction and habitat destruction for the past 30 to 60 years. We're the ones who are being culled. We're about to become a bit of a rare species, I think. All so that people like Gina Farts Rhinestones could sell more coal and more iron ore. So she could get rich because that was her father's obsession. And she fully inherited and embraced the obsession with seeing how rich you can get by digging crap up out of the ground and selling it to people who want to burn it. If Reagan and Gorbachev had nuked the world in 1984, 55% of the carbon that humanity has dug out of the ground and put in the sky would still be safely under the ground today, and global warming would have finished 9 years ago. But that is not what happened. We went ahead with the plan of endlessly growing the population so we could have the consumer demand to drive an endlessly growing economy so that we could become endlessly more profitable so we could drive up the stock market share price index. So that people who spent their working life back in the days when the environment had not been destroyed could retire and live in the lap of luxury. Now, they didn't want to retire on the pension, they wanted to retire on 50 or 60% of their final working wages. So therefore, their grandchildren's environment had to be trashed. And what could a person have done other than talk about it? If you talk about it, you're exercising your free speech, your right to protest. We did all that. Once upon a time, if you saw a logging operation in a state forest where you reckoned that the government laws were being broken, it was lawful for you to go and stand in front of a bulldozer and say, stop, my colleague is in town filing an urgent application for an injunction because we think you're breaking the law out here. And the bulldozer driver would have to stop and wait. And then if the greenies happen to be correct, the logging operation would have to back off and go back into their box and stop breaking the law. Because the people who wrote the laws back in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, they had decided that the environment is really important to human life and existence. Therefore, we had better protect the environment. However, the Chamber of Commerce and the business lobby, the financiers, the economists, they kept pushing for a readjustment of the balance, and their idea of a balanced situation back in the 1970s and 80s, it was to exploit 90% of the unimproved remaining forest and inland Australia. The bit that hasn't been farmed, go ahead and rip the guts out of 90% of it, and we'll leave you 10% for your national park for the greenies to go and feel good about. And they've done that several times. So we're now looking at absolute minuscule skeletal remnant populations of everything. Because the stuff that was untouched in the 1800s was left there because it was too far from market and it wasn't quite rich enough. The soil wasn't deep enough. The ore wasn't rich enough. You had to dig too much dirt to get to the pay dirt. The trees weren't long enough or tall enough or thick enough or straight enough, or there was a problem somewhere, so that got left alone. As all the easy stuff got consumed, the entrepreneurs have pushed further and further and further out. And now if you drive out along the road anywhere and you find yourself in a thick little sort of a patch and you stop your car and you get out and you start walking perpendicular to the general advance of the road, thinking you're going to get into thicker and deeper scrub country until you're going to come to the untouched virgin wilderness that, interior Australia is fantasised to be. And you bloody won't. You'll go through one valley and up over the top of the next one. And by the time you're into the next valley, you're running into the fence line of the farmer whose route to town is on the next road in the spider web or the parallel line of roads that cuts up all of the country. It's all been walked over by white men prospecting for gold 100 bloody years ago. The nearest gold field to here is probably 3 or 5 miles away. There's a place on this 100 acres where somebody's spent weeks digging a hole in the ground and messing around with sieves and looking for gold, trying to dig up the food and water recyclers so that they can burn it in the air recyclers so that they can manufacture little shiny metal trinkets and sell it to each other and call themselves rich. We live in interesting times and we have ringside seats. And at this point in time, one of the only games we've got left to play is wallowing in the frissons of Schadenfreude. The fact that it is all coming to pass. All of the horrible things that one's been worried about for fucking years and been castigated by the happy, clappy, Eddie, attaboy, go, get 'em, grow the fucking economy. We want to be the fastest lemming in the pack. We're going to get to the cliff firstest. And we're going to have Gucci fucking sand shoes or whatever it is that the fashionistas insist you got to have. Yeah, well, they've done it. The Bat Eaters Lament virus has now come out of the closet and it's stopped the bloody economy more or less in its tracks. And now the economy that was already barely breaking even when running at full speed, with every teenager being ground into the ground as an indentured slave on minimal wages, it's now had to stop for a couple of months. And everybody's been living on their savings. So there are no rich people ready to jump out of the closet and book a cruise. It's just not going to happen. People are going to have a go at making it happen, but I can't see how that's going to work. I think this is the wind down of the economy of the global vile age. It's been coming for a long time. It's not how the Greens Party envisaged it occurring. You know, they were talking about leaping to new technologies and being able to maintain a high-tech civilization where everybody still had a job. We just didn't rely on fossilized carbon for the energy to drive it all. And that was always an almost pathologically optimistic view, in my opinion. People who were talking about that have never really tried to get away from burning carbon. I know in 25 years I've halved the amount of carbon that I burn, but that means you just don't go places. And yeah, instead of having a record cold winter because we just had a record hot summer, what we've actually got is a prediction for above average temperatures all through the winter and a 50-50 prediction for average rainfall. So if we get average or above average rain, well, if we get above average rainfall, then the high temperature through winter won't be too perturbing. But if we get low rainfall and high temperature through winter, then spring's going to be a nightmare. And half the newspapers in Australia are completely consumed with worrying about when they're going to start playing feet brawl again. Legalised assault and battery for the entertainment of the masses. Steroid-pumped gladiators. 2 teams of latent homosexuals competing for possession of a symbolic sperm, getting lots of body contact as they stick their heads between another man's legs and sniff, all while attempting to put the symbolic sperm through the symbolic legs at their neighbouring tribe's end of the paddock. Yeah, yeah, that's the big thing we've got to worry about. When's the football going to start again? What colour purple spotted lilac are the spring fashions going to be in this year? When can we start going to rock concerts and horse race meetings again? These are the big issues. Not how the fuck are we going to try and feed everybody on the planet without making the weather worse by burning more carbon. One thing's for sure, the bloody airline industry's had the Royal Order of the Dick, and it's never going to become unfucked. You can't unfuck something. You can fuck it, but you can't unfuck it. And the airline industry can't be unfucked. Even if some places like Australia become coronavirus free, we're not going to permit anybody to come into Australia unless they go into isolation for 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, and come out testing negative. And the airline crew that flies them to Australia, they're going to have to go into isolation as well. And we're not going to let you run a load factor of 75% or above on the aircraft, despite the fact that you need 75% of your seats with a bum on them before you break even these days. Used to be 50%, but now it's 75%. It's not there's been an advance in aerodynamics or engineering. There's an advance in bureaucratic computerization that means that you can book people to aeroplanes more tightly without having problems with a computer. So yeah, the airlines are going to want to run 75 to 100% seat occupancy. And if Australia's become coronavirus free and you want to bring people in from overseas, we're going to insist that you have 2 empty seats for every seat that's occupied. So you're going to have a load factor of maximum 37%. So the price of your airline tickets is going to go up by at least 300% to cover the price of the empty seats that are never going to be filled. But somebody has to pay for them because they've got to be in the aeroplane to allow for the social distancing. You can't just run a smaller aeroplane with all its seats filled. That's not going to happen. And then you're going to have to add into the price of the 30% of the seats on the aeroplane having a bum on them. Onto the price of those tickets, you've got to add the entire cost of paying the cabin crew and the pilots to sit in isolation for 2 weeks before they're allowed to test and come out and talk to their family or go and fly another aeroplane anywhere else. Yeah, good luck running an airline industry or a tourism industry under those conditions. Apparently there are still freight aircraft moving, but I'm pretty sure the medical facts of the matter is that we're going to have to isolate those crews as soon as they fly into Australia. Bang, you're into the bloody motel for 2 weeks and you're going to have to be paid to sit in the motel, so therefore the cargo freight rate is going to go up to cover all of those added costs. And remember, this is all in an economy that was barely breaking even at a discount rate on everything, running on overtime, flat out. Yeah. Sayonara Nakamura. The thing to be grateful for is what a gentle downhill spiral we seem to be on. That could change if Trumpy decides he's going to nuke Wuhan to get even with the Chinese for the couple of million Americans that he's going to kill. He's already killed 1.5 times as many as died in the Vietnam War. Think America had 160-something thousand killed in the Second World War, and they had a total of 465,000 killed, wounded, and prisoner captured. So if he kills 1 million by Independence Day, he will have not only killed more than Vietnam, but he will have killed pretty much twice as much as the World War II. That's really quite an achievement for a game show host who'd been bankrupt 6 or 7 times before he was elected to hold America's nuclear launch codes. And the really exciting thing is he's wiped out his own voter base. 90% of the dead are over 60, and the average age of a Trump rally attendee is 67. Who knew the Chinese Wuhan fruit horseshoe bat paid such deep, close attention to what Greta Thunberg had to say last year? Must be bloody tough for the atheists who don't believe that there's any kind of a conscious plan or intelligence guiding the course of life and nature and the nature of the universe. But the biosphere of planet Earth is set up to maintain its own homeostasis by the concerted efforts of everything that's alive on Earth. It may or may not be a conscious, sentient gestalt which puts it all together. Doesn't matter. The mechanisms are there, like the Siberian snow daisy. So when the amount of solar radiation coming to Earth increases, it can rise by up to 10%. It'll just burn all the black Siberian snow daisies. All the snow daisies that breed will become white. The white will reflect the heat back out into space, and that will compensate for a 10% change in the amount of insolation. If it drops below normal, all the white snow daisies freeze and die, and only the few black ones, the ones that were living in the shade and managing to get by and not get cooked, they breed up. Siberia goes black. That absorbs more heat, compensates for the drop-off. The whole bloody planet runs like that. And when we commenced this industrial experiment, the fossil fuel powered version of harvest everythingism, we had no idea about 99.99% of the interlinks between the species which keep the whole system running. We've just, like I said, epileptic in the cockpit of a jumbo jet that hasn't got an autopilot. We've pushed, pulled, stepped and trod on everything in the friggin' cockpit. Oh, what fun. Wasn't that exciting? We've had a good run. Now we're going to see what it's like becoming, once again, a rare species. Humanity is about to become rare. And I've warbled on for long enough. See you next Sunday for episode 3 of Hot Mess. I mean, I'll probably upload other stuff in the meantime, but I think it's a good series. Ciao.